All right, welcome to our tutorial on shooting time-lapse. This is going to be a multi-video sequence. We're going to start off with setting up the camera. And this one's actually going to be pretty short and probably the least interesting one of the videos that cover shooting time-lapse. But my name is Jim Tierney, and I've been shooting time-lapse for about 5 or 6 years now. And we're going to go over some pretty cool stuff in here. Talk about shooting RAW versus JPEG, how to stabilize the camera, and a whole bunch of other good stuff, and also what makes a good time-lapse. And you can see some of the stuff that we'll be talking about, some of the shots that I've taken over the years, and specifically we're going to be talking about this shot, which is of the Bay Bridge, and this is what we're going to be breaking down, shooting the moon rising behind the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, and the lights coming up, and all that good stuff. But this is what we'll be taking a look at, so let's dive into it. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of briefly cover some of the things I think are important regarding camera setup. In this case, I'm just going to basically do a PowerPoint presentation using Photoshop, and hopefully this will last about a couple minutes, so won't take too long to get through. But just some things to remember. The most important thing is make sure you have a full battery and an empty memory card. You're going to be out shooting time-lapse for possibly several hours or longer, and you want to make sure that you have enough space on your memory card to capture all the images that you're going to be shooting, and also make sure that you have a full battery that will last the entire time you're going to be out there. It's extremely important. And also, quite often with time-lapse, you're out in a remote area, so you really want to have a checklist before you leave to make sure you haven't forgotten anything. You definitely don't want to get out there and realize you've forgotten your battery and or memory card. When I shoot, I usually shoot in aperture priority. This locks down the aperture and the camera varies the shutter speed. If you're shooting sunrise or sunset, I think this is an absolute necessity. I don't see how you can shoot a time-lapse otherwise. If you're setting up manually, the settings you're going to use for an hour or so before sunset are going to cause the frame to be practically dark by the time the sun even hits the horizon. So you really want to have the camera automatically adjusting the shutter speed and keeping the exposure more or less consistent. It's pretty easy to de-flicker video after the fact in post-production. And we're going to be talking a lot about post-production in these series of videos. Specifically, there's a plugin called Flicker Free by Digital Anarchy that is great at removing flicker. Now, you can shoot in manual, especially if you're shooting at night, where you're pretty much, the exposure is not going to change, the lighting isn't going to change because there is no light. So if you're shooting at night, manual mode is probably your best option. And certainly you can shoot manual mode if you're shooting for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day when the lighting is not going to change too significantly. But if you're in a situation where the lighting is going to change dramatically, like sunrise or sunset, I really do think it's necessary that you shoot in aperture priority. Now, one thing about shooting sunsets and sunrises is that I tend to cap the long exposure. So once the sun does go down, I actually have manual mode set up with a aperture and a shutter speed, say like 5 seconds. And once the shutter speed gets to about 5 seconds in aperture priority, I stop the camera and switch it to manual mode. And that way, from there on out, it's just taking 5-second exposures. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you're going to end up with increasingly long exposures, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds. And those are really not necessary for a good time lapse. I also usually shoot with a low ISO, since the camera is going to be on a tripod anyways, and I'm probably going to have long exposures at some point. You might as well shoot with a low ISO and not have too much noise on your images. Usually somewhere around an ISO of 320 is what I shoot at. You know, you can certainly vary that depending on your subject and what you're comfortable with, but I always aim for a low ISO. You want to have autofocus off. Usually what I do is manually focus the image before I start the time lapse, or just use autofocus, pick a point that I want to focus on, let autofocus do the focusing, and then turn it off, because you do not want autofocus changing the focus in the middle of your scene, especially if you're doing, again, a sunrise or a sunset or a time lapse where things are changing, which is often the case. Really no point in doing a time lapse if things aren't changing. But certainly if you're doing something like a sunset, your initial focus point is probably going to go into darkness as the sun goes down. And once that happens, if autofocus is on, the camera is going to start trying to find a different point to focus on, and that's going to pretty much ruin your time lapse at that point. So always remember to turn autofocus off. And the last really big thing is make sure you're shooting raw. And that's going to be the subject of the next portion of this video series. So thanks for joining me for this intro, and let's start getting into the meat of shooting time-lapse and talking about why you need to shoot raw. That's coming up in the next video.